The streets of Harlem held their breath that night. Even the usual clatter of loose bottles and distant footsteps seemed muffled, as if the city itself anticipated the coming storm. On 125th Street, under the flickering glow of a single lamppost, a shadow moved with purpose, his coat collar turned high against the chill. The world had learned long ago that some men carried more than guns. They carried a reputation that demanded silence, deference, and sometimes fear. He stepped into the alley where the tension was already palpable. Bumpy Johnson's bodyguard, known simply as Ace among the few who dared speak his name, was waiting. His eyes scanned the street like a hawk, calm but alert, every muscle coiled beneath his suit. Ace had seen threats come and go, but tonight was different. The whispers spoke of betrayal, of a man bold enough to challenge the king himself, and the bodyguard knew the hour had arrived. Across the street, the challenger appeared, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was known in half of New York. But in Harlem, across Bumpy Johnson's territory, reputation alone held no weight. The city had learned to respect the king, and anyone who underestimated him would quickly learn the consequences. The bodyguard's hand rested lightly on the handle of his weapon, a quiet promise of protection that needed no words. The challenger stopped under the lamplight, smirking, unaware that he was walking into a moment that would rewrite history. When the first words were exchanged, they carried the weight of entire communities. The challenger spoke of disrespect, of territory, and a test to see if Harlem's king was truly untouchable. Ace listened, his expression unmoved. Every movement was deliberate, every pause calculated. This wasn't a street scuffle or a petty quarrel. This was a showdown that would define loyalty, fear, and respect for years to come. The air tightened. Passers-by froze in doorways, eavesdropping without daring to intervene. Harlem held its breath, and in that pause, the sound of a single gunshot would echo louder than any scream. Ace moved with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, eyes never leaving the target. When the gun went off, it was not the chaotic burst of a desperate man. It was a single, deliberate note of authority. In that instant, the city seemed to pause, caught between disbelief and awe. The bullet struck, but it was not just the body that felt the impact. The streets themselves absorbed it, shifting the balance of power in a way no one had anticipated. What followed was not chaos, but a recalibration of respect. Whispers spread. The king was protected, untouchable, and anyone foolish enough to test him again would pay the price. By the time the sirens wailed in the distance, the scene was already etched into Harlem's collective memory. Ace had not just defended a man, he had reinforced a legend. One shot, executed in silence, had done more than save a life. It had reaffirmed an unspoken code of loyalty and power that no money, gun, or threat could break. As the night deepened, Bumpy Johnson himself emerged from the shadows, surveying the aftermath with a calm authority that made even hardened rivals flinch. He spoke softly to Ace, a few words carrying the weight of acknowledgement, trust, and gratitude. That single, understated exchange became another layer of the legend, a reminder that true power did not need to be loud to be undeniable. In Harlem, tales traveled quickly. By dawn, the story of the bodyguard's bullet had reached every corner of the neighborhood, seeping into the alleyways, the rooftops, the small diners, and the barber shops. Every listener understood the message. One man's loyalty, combined with precise action, could alter the course of history. And so, the legend began its next chapter, not through Bumpy Johnson's hands, but through the unwavering commitment of the bodyguard who acted without hesitation, without noise, and without doubt. One shot, one decision, one night, and Harlem would never forget it. Harlem in the 1950s was a place of contrasts, a neighborhood alive with music, ambition, and danger. Jazz clubs pulsed with life, speakeasies hummed with clandestine conversations, and the streets teemed with those who hustled, schemed, and survived. But beneath the vibrancy lay an unspoken law, enforced not by uniformed men, but by those who commanded respect on the streets. Bumpy Johnson was one such figure. Born into a world that offered little but hardship, Johnson had climbed the ranks with a combination of intelligence, charisma, and an unyielding sense of justice for his community. He understood the balance between fear and respect, between power and responsibility. Those who worked with him or against him knew that crossing him was more than foolish. It was dangerous. His reputation extended beyond the streets. Politicians, law enforcement, and rival gangsters all knew his name and the consequence of underestimating it. Ace, the man who had fired that pivotal shot, was more than a bodyguard. He was a symbol of Bumpy's reach and influence. He had been trained to move like a shadow, to anticipate threats before they emerged, and to act decisively when words failed. Harlem didn't just respect Bumpy Johnson, it respected those who executed his will with precision. Ace had earned his place at the side of a legend not through bravado, but through skill and loyalty that bordered on instinctual. The king's territory was a labyrinth of narrow streets and hidden corridors, a maze where information flowed faster than the law could intervene. It was a chessboard, and every move mattered. Rival factions tested boundaries, sometimes with guns, sometimes with whispers. Every day in Harlem was a negotiation, a display of power, and a test of courage. Johnson's ability to maintain order wasn't rooted in fear alone. It was his understanding of people, of politics, and of timing. Ace had witnessed this firsthand. He had seen men approach with arrogance, thinking wealth or muscle could bend Harlem to their will. And he had seen them leave humbled, broken, or worse. But the night the shot rang out was different. This was not a casual challenge. This was a direct affront to the king's authority, a statement that someone thought they could disrupt the balance Johnson had built. The city itself seemed to hum with anticipation that night. Rain had fallen lightly earlier, leaving the streets slick and reflective, and the flicker of neon signs from nearby bars danced on the wet pavement. The scent of fried food from corner carts mingled with tobacco smoke, creating a sensory backdrop for the tension about to unfold. Ace knew every step the challenger took would be watched, every breath measured. There was no room for error. One miscalculation, and the legend, the man, and the neighborhood could all pay the price. The community had an unspoken awareness of the king's presence. Shopkeepers closed doors a fraction of a second early, barbers paused mid-snip, and even street urchins froze at the sound of distant footsteps. Bumpy Johnson's influence extended beyond orders and muscle. It was woven into the fabric of Harlem itself. To challenge him was to challenge the city. The challenger, a man who had carved out a name through fear and intimidation in other boroughs, did not yet understand the dynamics of Harlem. He arrived with swagger, his companions following like shadows, unaware that the city watched more closely than they could see. His plan was simple: test the king, assert dominance, and take what he believed was rightfully his. But simplicity in intent rarely survives contact with Harlem's reality. Ace's role was clear: anticipate, protect, and execute. Every fiber of his being was trained to recognize threats, not just to Bumpy, but to the order he represented. As he observed the challenger approach, Ace read every subtle cue: the shift of weight, the tension in shoulders, the glint of ambition in eyes. It was a calculus of survival and authority, a game of precision with stakes higher than any man could articulate. And so the night unfolded with a deliberate pacing. The city, the people, and the streets themselves seemed to slow, acknowledging that something monumental was about to occur. It wasn't noise or chaos that marked the tension. It was silence. A silence that demanded attention, demanded respect, and demanded action. Ace understood this. He had trained for it. He had lived for it. And when the moment arrived, the world would pause at the sound of a single, decisive shot. By now, every corner of Harlem held a story of Bumpy Johnson. Tales of his clever negotiations, his ruthless precision, and his unyielding protection of his community had reached ears far beyond the neighborhood. But Ace's action that night would become a story all its own, a demonstration that loyalty, skill, and timing could alter history in ways words never could. It wasn't just about defending a man, it was about defending an entire legacy. Ace's presence, poised and ready under the lamplight, was the physical embodiment of Johnson's influence. When the gun finally discharged, it wasn't merely a bullet, it was a statement. One shot carried more than force. It carried authority, it carried respect, and it carried the weight of the legend himself. The shot rang out, sharp and precise, cutting through the night with a clarity that silenced the usual city hum. It was not the chaotic roar of a reckless attack. It was deliberate, surgical, and impossible to ignore. The king's bodyguard, Ace, had executed his duty with the calm certainty of a man who understood the stakes, a man who knew that one misstep could unravel everything Bumpy Johnson had built. On the street, the immediate reaction was a mixture of disbelief and awe. The challenger, confident just seconds before, now froze mid-step, his plans crumbling in the wake of Ace's bullet. The companions at his side stumbled back, unsure whether to fight, flee, or plead. Harlem itself seemed to inhale collectively, recognizing the gravity of what had just transpired. Respect, after all, was earned not through threats alone, but through action. And Ace had just spoken louder than any words ever could. Bumpy Johnson, standing a few feet away, did not flinch. He had instructed Ace, trained him, and trusted him. But he knew that even with the best preparation, moments like these carried uncertainty. His eyes scanned the scene with a calm calculation. The challenger's arrogance had met precision, and the streets now bore witness to the cost of disrespect. Johnson's reputation was already legendary, but the swift, decisive action of his right-hand man added another layer to the mythology. The antagonist, recovering from the initial shock, tried to assert control, barking orders and demanding explanations. But in Harlem, the rules were clear. One could not simply challenge the king without consequence. Ace stepped forward, the authority in his stance unmistakable. There was no hesitation, no question, just the weight of preparedness and the silent communication of lethal intent. The message was unmistakable. The king's orders were absolute. "You wanted to test the waters," Ace said, his voice low, deliberate. "Now you know how deep Harlem runs." The challenger's pride faltered. He understood, in that moment, that he had underestimated the rules of the streets and the force behind them. The look in Ace's eyes conveyed what the bullet already had. Any further defiance would be costly. In Harlem, reputation was not measured by threats, but by the courage and execution behind them. And Ace had just rewritten the lesson entirely. The bystanders, hidden in the shadows and behind windows, whispered in awe. Word of what had happened would travel fast. The narrative was no longer about Bumpy Johnson alone. It was about his reach, his influence, and the loyalty he inspired. Ace's action became a testament not just to personal skill, but to the collective strength of a leader who commanded unwavering respect. Tension lingered in the wet streets, thick as the smoke curling from a nearby bar. The challenger's men scrambled to regain composure, but the subtle shift in power was undeniable. The aura of dominance had swung entirely toward Johnson and his protector. Ace's presence was not just protective, it was declarative. He represented the enforcement of order, the execution of justice, and the subtle, unspoken authority that kept Harlem's streets in balance. The moment also served as a lesson to allies and rivals alike. In the aftermath, no one would doubt the reach of Bumpy Johnson's command or the capability of those he trusted most. The city, ever vigilant, registered the event in real time, a silent acknowledgement that one man's loyalty could alter the trajectory of power in a single decisive act. In the days that followed, the streets buzzed with conversation. The king's legend had grown, but so had Ace's. Stories circulated of the night. A single bullet changed the tone of Harlem. It was recounted in bars, whispered in alleyways, and discussed in the offices of men who operated on the fringes of legality. The act was more than protection. It was a statement, a recalibration of authority that reminded everyone of the delicate balance of respect and fear. The challenger, humiliated and exposed, was forced to retreat, his pride shattered and his plans dissolved. He learned in the most emphatic way that Harlem operated under its own code. One could not simply impose will without understanding the consequences. Ace's precision had rewritten the rules, demonstrating that authority without execution was meaningless, and that respect was enforced by those who embodied it. Ace himself remained unshaken. He understood the significance of what had transpired, but he did not allow ego to interfere. His role was not to seek recognition, but to uphold the order that Johnson had established, to act with clarity and decisiveness when words were insufficient. He moved with quiet confidence, fully aware that the streets were watching, that the city's pulse had shifted in the wake of his action. The king, observing from the shadows, allowed himself a rare small smile. The power dynamic had been preserved, and the challenge extinguished before it could escalate into chaos. Harlem remained under his careful watch, its streets safer, its order maintained, and its legend fortified. Ace had done more than protect a man. He had solidified the narrative of control, influence, and respect that defined Johnson's world, and so the night's events became etched into Harlem's memory. The story of the single, decisive shot traveled faster than any rumor, carrying with it a lesson about loyalty, timing, and the formidable presence of a man who executed a legend's will without hesitation. In the calculus of street power, few moments were as definitive, as transformative, or as enduring. The night air in Harlem held its usual chill, but there was an unmistakable heat simmering along the avenues, a tension that only grew after the shot. Word had already begun to travel, carried in hurried whispers between street corners, jazz clubs, and the stoops of tenement buildings. Everyone knew something monumental had occurred, and it bore the unmistakable signature of Bumpy Johnson. But this time, it wasn't just him. His bodyguard, Ace, had become a living testament to the lethal precision and loyalty that defined Johnson's inner circle. The streets themselves seemed to bend around the event. Harlem had always operated under an unspoken hierarchy, a code of respect enforced through influence, fear, and reputation. And in those few seconds, Ace had made it clear. Any attempt to disrupt that balance would be met with immediate consequence. Bumpy Johnson watched from the shadows as Ace approached the fallen challenger, his posture unwavering, every step deliberate. The man who had dared to defy him now realized the cost of misjudgment. Ace's eyes were sharp, unyielding, carrying the weight of someone who had been entrusted with not just a gun, but the responsibility to uphold a legend. "Consider this your warning," Ace said, his voice calm, controlled, but loaded with undeniable authority. "You disrespect the king, you answer to him, and I answer to him." There was no hesitation. The challenger's men trembled, the bravado they had carried moments earlier evaporating like smoke. Harlem's streets had long been a theater of power struggles, but rarely had a single act so clearly rewritten the narrative. This was not random violence. This was precision, authority, and inevitability, the kind of action that cemented stories into legend. Bumpy Johnson remained stoic, a quiet observer to the spectacle. He knew the significance of the moment. Ace's shot had done more than stop an immediate threat. It had sent a message throughout Harlem. Respect was not optional, and loyalty was enforced with clarity. Johnson's empire relied not just on his presence, but on the skill and decisiveness of those around him. And Ace had proven that the legacy of the king's authority was embodied in his people. Back in the streets, the community's response was immediate and electric. Neighbors watched from dimly lit windows. Barbershops paused mid-conversation, and every corner held a group retelling the event with hushed excitement. Harlem had witnessed a singular moment of power and consequence, a night when one bullet shifted the equilibrium of the entire neighborhood. Even the rival factions, men who had once thought themselves untouchable, re-evaluated their approach. The audacity to confront Johnson now seemed not only foolish, but suicidal. The precision and restraint demonstrated by Ace had transformed fear into understanding. In the calculus of power, you either respect the hierarchy or pay the price. Within hours, Harlem's underground network had already begun to absorb the implications. Bootleggers, street hustlers, and local politicians all understood the new order. Ace's action was more than protective. It was declarative. It reinforced Bumpy Johnson's dominance, but it also elevated the role of those who acted in his name. Loyalty was not passive. It required action, decisiveness, and, when necessary, lethal precision. Bumpy Johnson moved through the streets in the hours that followed, observing, listening, calculating. His presence was the anchor, but Ace's action had become the lightning rod. Together, they sent a message that was impossible to ignore. Challenges to authority in Harlem would be met not with negotiation, but with certainty. Meanwhile, the challenger was forced into retreat. Humiliated and exposed, he had learned a lesson most would never forget. In the theater of Harlem, appearances were fleeting, but actions were eternal. Ace's shot had not just altered a night, it had rewritten the boundaries of respect, reshaping the landscape for every player in the game. Inside the dimly lit rooms where deals were made and alliances forged, men debated the implications. One voice, low and cautious, remarked, "That wasn't just a shot, it was a statement. You don't cross Bumpy Johnson, and you sure don't cross the men he trusts." The room fell silent, each man weighing the consequences of ambition against the cold reality of consequence. Ace, for his part, remained unshaken. The adrenaline that might have fueled another man's pride had little hold over him. He understood the role he played, to act decisively when needed, to uphold the authority of a man who had earned his place in Harlem's history. The bullet had spoken, but Ace's discipline and restraint gave it weight. It was not recklessness that shaped legend, it was execution with clarity, timing, and purpose. The night ended not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. The streets returned to their usual rhythm, but the reverberations of the confrontation lingered like smoke. Harlem had been reminded of the fragility of arrogance, the weight of authority, and the undeniable force of loyalty executed without hesitation. By morning, the story had already become myth. Jazz musicians incorporated subtle nods to the tale in their improvisations. Shopkeepers recounted it to the curious and wary alike. And in bars where men calculated their next moves, the story of Ace's bullet became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the king's reach extended beyond his own hand. It moved through those who understood their duty to protect, enforce, and define the narrative of power. The streets of Harlem had been tested, and they had yielded a new chapter in the legend of Bumpy Johnson. Ace's action was the fulcrum upon which the balance of respect and fear now rested. The king's authority remained absolute, but now it was visibly reinforced, impossible to dispute. Every whisper, every glance, every calculated step acknowledged the new reality. One shot, one man, one decisive act could alter the course of an entire city. The aftermath was immediate, palpable, and merciless in its clarity. Harlem's streets, already tense from the night's events, seemed to pulse with a quiet awe. Shopkeepers whispered behind closed doors, children paused in mid-step on their way to school, and every corner carried the hum of a story retold with the weight of truth. Ace's bullet had done more than defend. It had rewritten expectations, reshaping alliances, recalibrating fear, and redefining loyalty. Bumpy Johnson moved through Harlem the next morning with a calm that belied the storm that had passed. His presence alone demanded attention. Neighbors stopped to nod. Men paused mid-conversation to acknowledge the king's dominion. But it wasn't just Johnson's name that carried weight anymore. It was the demonstration of power his bodyguard had executed. Ace had acted with the precision of a surgeon, yet the force of a hurricane, reminding everyone that Johnson's authority was absolute and unassailable. Across the city, rival factions scrambled to adjust their strategies. Men who had once considered Harlem a chessboard of opportunities now hesitated. They knew the rules, but that night had reinforced the stakes. Challenge the king, and a single act of loyalty could render your ambitions meaningless. The streets were listening, learning, and recalculating every step. Inside the clandestine rooms where deals were struck and alliances brokered, there was hushed reverence for the act. One mob associate, a seasoned player who had witnessed countless confrontations, muttered under his breath, "That wasn't just a gunshot. That was a message. That was a code in motion." And indeed, it was. Ace's bullet had spoken louder than any declaration of intent. It had defined boundaries, reinforced hierarchy, and sent a warning that would echo through Harlem for years. The challenger, now a humbled figure, had no choice but to retreat, nursing both pride and bruises. He realized, perhaps too late, that respect in Harlem was not requested. It was earned, defended, and enforced with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Ace's shot had reminded everyone that miscalculation in Johnson's world came with immediate, irreversible consequences. Meanwhile, the community's reaction was nuanced but profound. Harlem thrived on stories of triumph and consequence, and this was one that would endure. Mothers recounted it quietly to children, jazz musicians infused it into their melodies, and local shopkeepers observed with careful eyes, understanding the power shift that had just taken place. It was a lesson in authority, loyalty, and the relentless precision required to maintain order in a world where law often faltered. Even law enforcement, usually detached from the inner workings of the neighborhood, could not ignore the ramifications. Reports reached precincts about a night when Harlem had seemed to collectively hold its breath. Detectives, hardened by years on the force, noted the absence of chaos, the discipline in execution, and the unmistakable reinforcement of Johnson's influence. The lesson was clear. There was power beyond the badge, power built on respect, loyalty, and the willingness to act decisively. Ace, for his part, returned to his routine with quiet resolve. There was no celebration, no swagger, no posturing. He had acted on principle, executing his duty with precision, and he understood the weight of what that act meant. In Bumpy Johnson's world, legend was not just born from action. It was solidified through disciplined execution. The bodyguard's shot had rewritten expectations, but Ace himself remained the disciplined guardian, ever vigilant, ever loyal, a reflection of the man he served. Johnson himself, walking the streets in the wake of the confrontation, recognized the power of that night not just as a victory over a rival, but as a reaffirmation of the principles he had long embodied. Loyalty, discipline, and calculated force were the pillars of his rule. And now the streets themselves bore witness. Each glance from a passerby, each quiet acknowledgement from a rival, reinforced the reality. The king's domain was intact, his authority unquestioned, and his legend unmistakable. Rumors of retaliation or further challenge began to circulate, but the clarity of Ace's action had preempted most ambition. Men considered their next moves with caution, understanding that Harlem's chessboard had just been rearranged with ruthless efficiency. The night's events were no longer just a story. They were a blueprint, a visual and visceral reminder of what happens when the king's authority is tested. By the afternoon, Harlem had resumed its rhythm, yet the lesson of the night lingered like smoke in the alleyways. Conversations, nods, and even subtle gestures carried the memory of the shot, the precision of the action, and the absolute enforcement of power. It was a justice that needed no courtroom, a declaration that required no words beyond the report of a single, decisive gun. Even as the sun dipped low over 125th Street, casting long shadows across the stoops and brownstones. The echoes of that night resonated. Bumpy Johnson's authority had not merely survived, it had been reinforced, elevated, and immortalized. Ace's bullet had altered the narrative, changing how the streets perceived power, respect, and consequence. And in the quiet corners, in the whispered exchanges, the community acknowledged the same truth that every rival now faced. In Harlem, legend was not just claimed, it was defended, enforced, and, when necessary, executed. Time has a way of solidifying legends, and for Bumpy Johnson, the events of that night became more than a single act of defense. They became a defining moment that etched his name into the fabric of Harlem's history. Word spread quickly, not just in whispers, but in firm acknowledgement across streets, bars, and jazz clubs, where men and women spoke of power, loyalty, and consequence as if reciting scripture. The bullet that Ace fired was more than a physical act. It became symbolic. It signaled a standard, a code that every resident understood without question. You do not disrespect the king, and you do not underestimate the men who serve him. Each step Johnson took after that night carried weight, and every handshake, every nod reinforced a reputation that was now unassailable. Even within his own ranks, the impact was undeniable. Men who had once tested boundaries now moved with careful deference. The Qayyum young bloods, eager to prove themselves, studied Ace's precision and Johnson's command, realizing that the streets did not reward recklessness, but respect, cunning, and disciplined loyalty. The hierarchy of Harlem became clearer than ever, with Johnson at the apex, his authority reinforced by both fear and admiration. Historical context further amplified the significance of that night. Harlem in the mid-20th century was a crucible of social, economic, and racial tension. The city itself often ignored the lives and rules that governed the neighborhood, leaving the streets to enforce order in their own way. Within that framework, Johnson's influence was not merely about crime or profit. It was about survival, dignity, and maintaining a fragile balance. Ace's decisive action had ensured that balance would remain, that the neighborhood would continue to operate under the rules established by its most formidable figure. Rivals learned quickly. Strategy without respect was folly. Attempts at intimidation faltered under the silent memory of the shot that had changed everything. The ripple effect reached corners of the city where Johnson's influence had previously been rumored, but never proven. Men in Brooklyn, Newark, and even in the higher echelons of the underworld began to acknowledge a simple truth. The King of Harlem commanded loyalty and action in ways no one could ignore. Ace, the bodyguard who had fired the shot, became a figure in his own right, though always in the shadow of Johnson. His precision, discipline, and unwavering loyalty became legendary, a benchmark for what it meant to serve a true leader. Young men who sought to learn the unspoken rules of Harlem watched him closely, understanding that heroism in this world was measured by competence, courage, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. The king himself remained remarkably composed. Bumpy Johnson understood that legend was not merely about surviving a single night of danger. It was about ensuring that the memory of that night carried forward with the right lessons intact. Every decision, every interaction after that moment reinforced the narrative. Loyalty would be rewarded, disrespect punished, and the streets would remember. Years later, when historians and chroniclers examined Harlem's intricate history, the night Ace fired the gun would often be cited as a turning point. Not because it was the first confrontation, nor the last, but because it crystallized the essence of Johnson's rule. Power, respect, and calculated force were no longer abstract concepts. They were tangible, real, and forever intertwined with the lives of those who walked the streets of Harlem. The neighborhood, too, benefited in subtle ways. Crime and chaos, when unchecked, could spiral into terror. But Johnson's authority brought a strange form of order. Merchants could operate without fear of arbitrary extortion. Residents could move with a measure of safety, and the rules of engagement were clear. Ace's bullet had done more than defend a man. It had defended the community's stability and dignity. By the time the sun rose over Harlem weeks later, the memory of that shot had become legend. Conversations referenced it with respect, fear, and awe. The streets themselves seemed to acknowledge the change. The invisible lines drawn that only the truly powerful could navigate. Bumpy Johnson's status was no longer in question. It had been cemented by courage, loyalty, and the decisive actions of a man who understood that sometimes a single moment could define a lifetime. This wasn't just about one man's power. It wasn't about a single bullet or even a single night of tension. It was about a principle that the streets of Harlem had understood for generations. Respect is earned, loyalty is sacred, and authority is reinforced by action when words fail. Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem, didn't need to boast. He didn't need empty threats. His legend was measured in the weight of silence after a room held its breath, in the cautious nods of rivals, and in the unwavering loyalty of men like Ace, whose hands did what words could not. That single, precise shot, fired in the quiet yet deadly tension of confrontation, became the proof of a system, a code, a rule that the neighborhood lived by. For the people of Harlem, the events of that night became more than a story. They became a lesson. Life in the streets demanded understanding power, measuring risk, and recognizing those who upheld order even when the world around them threatened to crumble. Johnson's reign was not about fear alone. It was about creating a structure where respect dictated action, and justice, however unconventional, ensured survival and dignity. And Ace? He became a legend in his own right, a reminder that even the smallest actions, when executed with loyalty and precision, could shape history. The streets remembered, and so did history. Sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world what loyalty truly means. Sometimes it takes a single moment, a single act of courage, to rewrite the rules entirely. And sometimes, in the silent aftermath of a gunshot, the streets themselves bow to the power of a man who earned their respect, not through words, but through action. Bumpy Johnson's legacy endured, not merely because he survived, but because those who witnessed his reign learned that honor, loyalty, and decisive action were more powerful than any weapon. The king's rule was cemented, the streets remembered, and the legend lived on. The night the gun went off was silent, but its impact echoed for generations.